about the last 6 to 9 months, I guess, which is around the topic of truthiness, which for anybody who's not familiar with that word, you soon will be. For those of us who are a little bit older in the audience, you might recognize the word from the Stephen Colbert Report, but we'll get into that in a minute. I've been really delighted so far during Psychology Week to see that I'm not the only person thinking about misinformation and fake news. Multiple people have been talking about it. I would argue that we are perhaps living in an age of misinformation, where with the promulgation of the internet and social media, it's maybe even easier than ever to spread misinformation out into the world. And we should be concerned with that as a society, what it means for what people think and believe and remember about experiences they are and are not having as a result of misinformation. One modern way of thinking about that term is to use the phrase fake news, especially when you're talking about kind of media manipulations. And as you may have heard or not already in Psychology Week, fake news is actually a really ancient term, or misinformation is as well, but it has been kind of repopularized more recently. And in fact, in 2016 is when it really kind of took off into conscious awareness, public conscious awareness again. Here you just see some data using Google Trends, which just tracks sort of Google search data, how popular different terms are. The black line here represents search terms for fake news. And I've just put an arrow which points down to November 2016, which is where it really sort of exploded back into public awareness again, or that people started searching for it again, fake news. And I don't think it takes a lot of thought to think about why it suddenly became more popular again. But like I say, it's an ancient problem, this idea of fake news and misinformation. And it has very real consequences. If any of you were at Keith's talk yesterday on how to detect and how to protect yourself against fake news, he brought up one of the conspiracy theories, modern conspiracy theories, I'll get the word eventually, about the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which was started by, I think around the sort of the same kind of time as the QAnon conspiracy started to get drummed up as well, about an underground pedophile ring being run by Democratic candidates, Democratic political people. No evidence for it whatsoever, but once these things take off, people start believing in them. And it surrounded the idea that one of the places where this horrible stuff was taking place was a pizza parlor, which eventually somebody actually took a rifle into and shot a few rounds. I don't think anybody was injured, but still, this is a consequence of fake news and misinformation. So just to say that this is something that does have very real and serious, dangerous consequences sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes it can be quite flippant and not all that big of a deal, but situations like Pizzagate show that it really can. And what's interesting about Pizzagate for me, and why I've chosen this particular sort of distressing image, is that it's reminiscent of some earlier conspiracy theories that came around in the early to mid 90s. Surrounding issues of people claiming to have been involved or knowing other people who were involved in ritualistic satanic abuse cults. And it turns out there are maybe potentially similar underpinnings to how these sorts of conspiracies develop. Nonetheless, to say that they can have very, very real consequences when people are, for example, accused of being involved in these things without any evidence to say that they were. Well, of course, with the re-rise in popularity of the term fake news, lots of people, and Dr. Keith talked about this yesterday, have tried to figure out, okay, how are we going to stop the problem? And lots of different agencies have sprouted ideas about what we can do or what we might think about doing. News Literacy Project is one of them, for example, but many other agencies as well, including, ironically, some of the very agencies who may be spreading fake news themselves, like Facebook, for example. And of course, psychological scientists, we've got on board as well now because we want to figure out what we can do to try and fight this problem. I think maybe the problem is more interesting and more nuanced than we're giving it credit. I'm not sure if that's the right phrase, giving it credit for though, and that there are many subtle forms of misinformation or manipulation out in the world that we are deceived by, but we can also deceive ourselves by, just by the way that we think about and process information. And that's what's interesting to me as a cognitive psychologist. And in particular, what I'm going to try and hit us towards today is the idea that is a famous big idea in cognitive psychology, that we tend to operate in one of two different ways of thinking about the world. One of which seems to be relatively effortless and relatively quick, what we call a heuristic style of thinking about the world, that often leads you to a correct or good enough response because it's quick and effortless. Down the other end of the scale, there is a more slow and effortful, more critical style of thought, or analytical, but that takes time and doesn't tend to be our default mode of thinking. And the trouble is that heuristic or relatively quick way of thinking can sometimes, in the right situations, lead us to the incorrect conclusions. We can actually end up deceiving ourselves just by the way we're thinking about information. One of those heuristics that I want us to think about today, and it's going to be really critical when I talk about the research we're doing, is the idea of fluency. Fluency, for the purposes of what I'm talking about here, is a subjective feeling you get when you are thinking about information, how easy or difficult the experience feels when you are thinking about some kind of information. So some things that we think about feel relatively easy to think about. Other things can feel relatively difficult to feel about. What's interesting is that we know that feeling on its own can influence what you think, remember, and believe, or judge or make decisions about in all kinds of different contexts. So when that happens, when people are prone to the influence of their fluency, how easy or difficult it feels to think about information, in psychology, we would call that a fluency effect. They're being driven by their own fluency. That's been demonstrated in a whole bunch of different domains, a whole bunch of different contexts now. I can maybe give you a quick example to illustrate the sort of thing that I'm thinking about here or trying to demonstrate to you. Suppose, for example, I was to ask you a question about this person here, who we know nothing about. All I do is I give you their name, and I ask you to make it a judgment about them, like maybe how much you would trust this person. In this situation, you really don't have anything to go off. You know nothing about the person. You don't know what they look like. You don't know their history. You don't know their background. All you have is a name, and one that is relatively difficult to pronounce. In fact, I'm not even going to try because it looks too difficult for me. Question is, what does that feeling you get just from processing the name, from trying to think about how it's pronounced, influence the judgments you might make about that person, especially if it's relative to, say, this kind of example on the right, which is relatively easy for you to think about and to pronounce that particular name, for most people anyway. Well, we know from research that's actually been done that if this simple manipulation of just how easy or difficult it is to pronounce somebody's name will influence a variety of judgments about what they think about those people, including how well liked they are and how much they trust them and so on and so forth. So that's just one way that you can manipulate the feeling of fluency that people get about some information they're processing that can lead to changes in their behavior. And it's been shown across a number of different decisions or outcomes that people make for behavior now, including how frequent they think something is, how familiar they think something is, whether they've seen it before or not, even when that's true or false, how much they like things, how much they trust things, whether they think things are risky versus safe, whether they think claims are true or false, whether they think they remember things or have simply imagined them in the past, and more and more and more. The list kind of just goes on, and building up this evidence base that how easy or difficult it feels to process information can influence what you think about it or the judgments that you make about that information. What I find really interesting, or one area where I find this stuff really interesting, is that it's also been demonstrated for just showing people photographs and what we might call a photographic fluency effect, or as you'll see later on, maybe a better name is a truthiness effect. So back in 2012, a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Erin Newman, ran a study in which she gave people claims, a series of claims to make, and they were about celebrities. And she gave people a list of celebrity names one at a time. And for each of those celebrities, she asked people something like this: is John Key alive? Or it might have just, rather than a question, it might have been a statement. John Key is alive. And for each statement, for each celebrity name that people saw, they were just asked to make a true or false decision. Is that true or is that false for this claim that you're seeing about this person? Now here, it's just the claim on its own. You've got nothing to work with. Probably you don't know who this celebrity is, but I promise you it is a celebrity, and I'll reveal who it is right now. It's this person here, and I'm assuming that for most of you also the photo isn't helping you at all. You're still like, that's a stranger to me. I have no idea who that person is. For those of you who are maybe really politically savvy, you might recognize that as a former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And so the question becomes, how do people respond to these basic claims, which many of them, they don't actually know the answer to at all. They're kind of ambiguous, in the presence of or in the absence of a photograph. And what's important about these photographs here is that they don't really help you answer the question at all, or the claim itself. They don't tell you whether it's true or false. There's nothing in the photo that you can use to actually answer the question. We would call this maybe a decorative photograph or a non-probative photograph. It doesn't really give you the answer. Nonetheless, the question is, does it anyway promote a feeling of easiness of thinking about the claim that you're viewing, which might then lead people into saying true more often in the presence of the photograph than in the absence of the photograph? That is in fact what Dr. Newman and her colleagues discovered, is that when you give people these kinds of claims in the presence of a photo, they are more likely to say that that claim is true than in the absence of the photo. And it doesn't matter whether the claim is true or false. In ambiguous situations where you're not really certain of what's going on, you will tend to draw on whatever information you can around you to try and help you answer these kinds of questions. What you draw on here is a feeling that you seem to be getting from that photograph. She also asked people the reverse question. So she would ask, for some celebrities, are they dead? Not alive, but dead. And you see a similar pattern of results, that people are just more likely to say true in the presence of a photo than in the absence of a photo. The researchers who conducted that study, they decided to coin the term the truthiness effect. That is, the truthiness effect is the feeling of truth you get from the presence of a decorative photograph when you're processing some kind of information or claim, which they didn't actually invent. They've borrowed it from Stephen Colbert, the comedian, who actually originally coined the term back on his very first Colbert Report show in 2005. And he defined truthiness in his wonderful comedic style as truth that comes from the gut, not from facts. But when you stop and think about it, it's really quite an appropriate term for what people are doing here. They're relying on that kind of gut level instinct feeling that they're getting to drive what they think is true or false about some claims. What do we really think photos are doing? Well, we don't exactly know. We don't have a great explanation, but one idea is that photos act as a kind of cognitive springboard. That is, they help you bring to mind more easily than in the absence of a photo related thoughts, images, and feelings that you might have about some information that you're processing or thinking about. And therefore, it feels easier as a result to think about the information at hand, and that can lead you to making certain decisions, that easiness that you get, that subjective feeling. Well, then fast forward now to 2019/2020, it seemed an appropriate research question to ask, would you see a similar kind of pattern of results in other kinds of domains or contexts? So Dr. Newman and her colleagues showed that for basic trivia claims and for claims about celebrities, whether they're alive or dead, you can make people believe that claims are more true when you present them with a photo than without. It seemed like a good opportunity to ask the same sort of question. What influence does a photo have on people's judgments when they're asked claims about the coronavirus, for example? That might be important information to know, because we know that people believe different things about claims about the coronavirus, which can have very serious outcomes for later behavior, like whether they're likely or not to get a vaccine, for example. We also know that these claims have been heavily politicized. So there's a question of whether you would still see the influence of the photograph in this kind of context, using claims that do have this politicized kind of element to it, sad that it may be. And so that's kind of where we lead to our research question, which is we're interested in trying to figure out to what extent will decorative photographs influence the judgments that people make about coronavirus claims. That's our basic research question. So the hypotheses here in this research question, we're going with the background research that shows that photos seem to promote a sense of fluency. That is, they seem to make information that comes with photographs feel easier to think about and process. And we know that that feeling, that subjective feeling of fluency or easiness of thinking, tends to promote judgments of truth, truthiness. So then our prediction becomes that when we give people coronavirus claims and pair them with photos, we're predicting that people might think those claims are true more often than if we paired those claims without a photo, just the claims on their own. So to address that, we ran an experiment in which we showed people a variety of different coronavirus claims, some of which were true, some of which were false, some of which we paired with photographs, and some of which just appeared on their own, just the claims. And for each of the claims that we showed people, we asked them to rate the extent to which they thought each was true or false. Just to give you an example of what people were seeing, it's something like this. You see a claim, coronaviruses are thought to spread most often by respiratory droplets, and people just rate that claim on a scale from 1, definitely false, through to 5, definitely true. Sometimes that claim would appear on its own, as you're seeing here. Sometimes it would appear with a decorative photograph like the one you see here. The photograph is related to the claim in some way, but doesn't really help you answer the question, doesn't tell you whether it's true or false. Here's another example. The coronavirus is actually a bioweapon. Again, people see this claim and they make a judgment about it. Sometimes it will appear on its own. Sometimes it appears with a photograph. That's the basic element of the experimental paradigm. We also asked people, because of the political nature of the coronavirus claims, just to tell us their political identification or affiliation, just rated on a 1 to 7 scale from far left through to far right. For the purposes of simplicity, when I get to the results, I'm going to collapse these down for you. So I'm just going to take the 3 on the left and call those people left. I'm going to take the group in the center and call them center. And I'm going to take the 3 on the right and collapse them together into the right, just for purposes of simplicity. But if you have any questions about the more nuanced stuff, I can tell you that at the end for sure. So what did we find? I'm going to walk you through the results that we found from experiment 1 here. On the horizontal axis here, I'm going to present the false claims about coronavirus on the left, and I'm going to present the true claims over on the right. The dark gray, dark bluish bars are going to represent the claims when they just appeared on their own in the absence of a photo. The lighter bars, the lighter gray / bluish bars, will represent claims when they appeared with the photograph. And on the vertical axis here, you just have the average rating people gave across the claims. Down the bottom would be 1s, which is saying they're definitely false. Going up the scale as you head toward the 5 is definitely true. So basically you can think as false is down, people saying false is down, and true is up here. So what did we find? Let's take a look first at the false claims. We see that people, regardless of whether there is a photo or not, seem to be giving about similar ratings for the truthiness or the falsiness of these claims. In other words, we do not find that the photograph is making people more prone to saying that the claims are true. There seems to be not much of any difference going on based on the photograph at all. Let's look over on the right then at the true claims, and what we see is exactly the same sort of pattern. So regardless of whether people were rating claims that are actually true or claims that are actually false, the photograph, the presence or absence of a photograph, did not seem to influence their judgment about those claims, which is actually not what we were anticipating. We thought that the photo bars were going to be higher here, that people were going to say true more often to claims when they appeared with a photograph. Well, forget the photographs for a moment then. Let's talk instead about people's political identification here. What kind of influence did that have on people's judgments? So now on the horizontal axis, you've got the 3 political groupings, people who said they're on the left, people in the center, and people who say they're on the right. We're going to have now the dark gray bars representing the false claims we gave people, the light gray bars representing the true claims we gave people. The vertical axis is the same thing again. It's just the average rating people gave across the claims. When you look at people who are on the left, you can see that for the false claims, they're very close to the bottom here. Most of them are saying somewhere around definitely or probably false for those claims. And for the true claims, it's the opposite. They're quite close to the roof there. They're saying true a lot for the true claims. I would describe this as people being relatively well calibrated to the truth of the world. They tend to know when false claims are false, and they tend to know when true claims are true. The question, of course, becomes what happens when you look at the other groups now. In an ideal world, everyone here should look the same, right? It shouldn't matter what people's political affiliation is, but that's not what happens. And in fact, as you progress across the graph here, you see that false claims are becoming more true the further you go across, and true claims are becoming more false the further you go across. In other words, it seems like people are less calibrated to what's true and false out in the world the further you head towards the right on the political spectrum here, which is a very interesting result, and I have to admit is totally not what I had anticipated and is a lot larger of an effect. In fact, it dwarfs any kind of photo effect that's ever been demonstrated in the literature. It's much larger in terms of its magnitude. So overall, then, from that first experiment, we seem to be finding a really strong influence of people's political affiliation and what they believe about these coronavirus claims, but nothing really in favor of this idea that photographs are promoting a feeling of truthiness for people, making them say true more often. Well, then the question becomes, of course, like, why is that? Given that previous literature has been able to demonstrate that you can find that photos influence people's judgments, what's going on in our study maybe that's not leading to that kind of situation? I don't know. There could be a variety of things going on that might lead to people not being prone to the influence of a photo here. It's certainly the case that it could have something to do with the fact this is such a politically driven, divisive topic. Maybe that's why in those kinds of situations, you just don't find that people are prone to the subtle manipulation of the presence of a decorative photograph. Well, one way to address that question then would be to run another experiment in which we gave people claims that were not so maybe politically controversial. So in a second experiment, what we'd like to do is to give people basically exactly the same kind of paradigm, ask the same kind of question: to what extent do people influenced by photographs about now just general health claims? So not necessarily ones that have anything to do with the coronavirus per se, but just general health claims that maybe don't have so much of that political kind of influence to them. Would we see an influence of the photographs there, or would we not? And so that's actually what we're going to be doing in a second experiment. Again, similar hypotheses. We think that photographs promote that feeling of easiness. That easiness promotes a feeling of things being true. And therefore, we're anticipating that when we give people general health claims that appeared with photos, they will be more likely to answer true to claims. So in experiment 2, what we'll be doing is giving people a variety of just general health claims, not coronavirus ones. We won't mention coronavirus claims at all. Some of those will be true, some will be false, some will come with photos, some will not. And it's exactly the same paradigm. People will just be rating the extent to which each is true or false. Just to give you a sort of example of the kinds of claims people might see, something like this: there are more than 100 types of arthritis. Again, people are just rating these claims on a scale. Sometimes that will come with a photo, sometimes not. Or a claim like this one: human blood in veins is blue due to a lack of oxygenation. Again, just rating these claims true or false. The question, of course, what will we see when we look at the results of this study? We haven't actually run it yet, so we don't know, but I have a couple of hypothetical ideas about what we might see. So on the horizontal axis here, we have our false claims on the left, our true claims on the right. Dark gray bars will represent claims when they're not paired with a photo, just on their own. Light gray bars or blue bars will represent claims when they come with a photo. And that vertical axis, again, is just the same thing that you've seen before. False down the bottom, true up the top. How do people rate these claims? We might see something that looks like this. That is that when people are rating the claims, regardless of whether they're true or false, there's no real influence of the photo. No difference based on how people rate the claims, based on whether there is a photo or not, which would replicate the pattern of results we found in our earlier experiment, and could suggest maybe a couple of different things. It could suggest that maybe health claims aren't really prone to this feeling of truthiness that's generated from a photo. It could suggest that there's something about our paradigm that's just not working. Or, and I think this is really important to consider, it could suggest that maybe we need to rethink this idea of truthiness and just how influential a photograph can be. And I'll return to that idea later. But I should entertain maybe in favor of a more optimistic approach, we could see something that instead looks like this, where people are saying true more often when claims come with a photo than when claims are presented on their own. That would be evidence in favor of a truthiness effect, that the photo is making people say true more often to these claims, and would be consistent with some of that prior research as well. If this is what happens, then we'll have the question of trying to figure out what's going on with the coronavirus claims specifically. Why do they not seem to be prone to the influence of a photo? I think regardless of what happens though, advancing these experiments forward probably is a variety of different things we could be running here. It should give us a more nuanced understanding, at least, of the conditions or contexts under which photos are able or not able to promote that feeling that people get of a fluent style of processing, which we know can influence their judgments. And I think regardless of what we find, there are potential implications we should be thinking about here as well. It's well established now that it's relatively trivial to manipulate what people believe, think, and remember about different experiences, different information they're processing by presenting that information with or without a photo. That's been demonstrated in numerous different contexts. Lots of different manipulations show that to be true. It's especially problematic when photos are doctored. So when they're manipulated to represent false things, when they actually contain false information in them, those are especially problematic. And there are lots of instances, I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with these sorts of things happening in the world, but We've shown that it happens in military contexts. The military has been shown to doctor photos, which is disturbing, but so have virtually all of the major news agencies, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently, presenting information in ways that is sometimes obviously misleading and sometimes done in quite subtle ways to try and manipulate what people think and believe about certain information. My concern right now is that I think we're on the precipice of a much bigger problem, a much more worrying and alarming phenomenon, which I'm going to try to demonstrate in this video here. I'm not sure how well it will play or whether it'll work over Zoom. It's not really all that important because you probably have already seen it before because it went viral. But I think this kind of thing is really worrying.
Got me right there, Steve. Hey, what's up, TikTok? Look, I do a lot of my own stunts, but I also do a lot of industrial cleaning, okay? So, obviously, you keep your hands clean, but you need that exfoliating product to really cut through the grime.
So that's, I mean, you're probably aware, and it's kind of hashtag there, that's not a real video of Tom Cruise. And I think a lot of us who maybe knew about it going viral before we saw it, or knew that it was a deep fake, what these things called deep fakes before we saw it, probably have a hindsight bias, and that we look at it and we're like, that's clearly fake, right? I really doubt that's actually true. I think people really have a hard time determining whether these things are actually doctored or not. And my concern is that we're leading into a situation where human beings will no longer be able to tell what's true or false based on video or photographic information. We will have to rely on other computers to tell us what's true or false. And there's big questions and worries that come along with that. So certainly there were very worrying implications about doctored photos and doctored video footage and what that means for what people believe about information they're thinking about. But on the other hand, some of the evidence that we seem to be accruing might suggest that some of the concerns we have about truthiness or the manipulation of people's beliefs based on photographic or video information might be overblown. And maybe we need to revisit the idea of truthiness. And I think I can give you an example to illustrate what I mean here. Back in 2008, a couple of researchers published some work showing that if you give people a scientific article and then put a pretty picture of a brain in it, like you see here on this slide, they showed that it will make people more likely to agree with the claims that are presented in that scientific article. So a piece of neuroscience, some like full of technical jargon terms, you can make people more prone to believe it's true just by throwing a pretty picture of the brain in that article, even though that pretty picture tells you nothing at all, right? It's just a picture, it's just decorative. This study became really widely popularized because, of course, it's kind of very interesting that it should have any influence at all when the photo tells you nothing. But it turns out that later researchers, including me and a bunch of my colleagues, have tried to replicate that effect and show that actually the image of the brain seems to do almost nothing at all. It really does not have a powerful influence on what people believe about some scientific article they're reading. The difference in terms of when you present the article with and without a photo, in terms of the ratings that people make, is so close to zero that it's practically meaningless. And so it's only through later work that we were able to establish that this particular phenomenon, using a photo in this context, does not seem to have the kind of powerful influence that we once thought it did. And I worry that maybe we should be asking the same sorts of questions about other forms of photographic manipulation as well, and what it means for people's behavior. I think I should just very briefly talk about some of the limitations that are involved in the work that we've done so far. One glaring potential problem is the methodology we've used. I mean, as a consequence of being in the pandemic when we were running this kind of research, it's done online through the Qualtrics survey platform, which means we lose some of the control over people's behavior that we might ordinarily want in a lab kind of setting. Another thing to think about, and this is true a lot of the Fluency research, is that usually you try and control for how long people spend processing the information, because you really want them to try and adopt that more heuristic, quick and effortless style of thinking. So often studies like these will actually give people a certain time limit to respond. So you've got to kind of make your decision within, say, 3 seconds or so, trying to encourage people more into that heuristic style of thinking. We haven't done anything with response timing so far. So it could be the case that maybe people are responding in the way that they're responding in our data because they're just taking time and thinking more carefully about the information that's in front of them, not so prone to those heuristic styles of thinking. We also don't know a lot about the specificity here, which is part of the reason why we're trying to do experiment 2 and maybe some other experiments as well, testing the idea of whether these photographs are influential in other domains, other contexts. Does it work in other settings? Some other people have done some of that work and have demonstrated that you can find these kinds of fluency or photographic manipulations affecting people in different kinds of domains, but there's still certainly a lot of work to be done there. What I think is probably the most important work to be done, though, and what our severe limitation is that we really don't have a good grasp of explanations behind what's going on here, particularly in our first experiment where we show that there's a political difference. It's really not clear what is underpinning that political difference. Is it just that people are exposed to different messaging out in their, like, when they encounter media about it? Is that it? Is that the only explanation? Is it that people are less able to think critically across the political spectrum? Does that contribute? We just don't really have a good explanation for what's driving that difference at the moment, nor do I think we have a really good explanation for the basic effect of the photo as well, when we are able to demonstrate it, why that takes place either. Which leads to questions about, of course, what we should be doing next. I suspect that at some point soon, people are going to need to do replications of some of those original truthiness studies, looking more closely into when and why it is that photos do or do not promote differences in people's behavior, why sometimes they seem to be influenced by a photograph and say true or false, or I like this thing more, I remember this thing more, and so on, all sorts of different judgments, versus when they do not. Because it seems to be the case that other people are tending to find difficulty in replicating some of these basic effects, which will be good because ultimately it should lead to better explanations of the phenomena of interest, why they are happening in the first place. So that's all I have today. I'm hoping people will have questions or comments, particularly students. I'd love to hear from students if anybody has anything to say. The reason we put these things on is for you. That's why we do this. So I love to hear from you. Not that of course I want to hear from my colleagues as well, but I just would love to hear something from students if they have any questions or comments. And just quickly, I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Mario Baldassari at the University of St. Francis and Dr. Tanji Mazard at Quest University in Canada, and of course to graduate and undergraduate students in my lab who have really helped with this project so far. It's been an absolute joy. And it's been so fun coming here today as well. I look forward to any questions you have. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Michal, for your wonderful presentation. I have learned a lot, and yeah, that was amazing. So thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand and speak up.
If I zoomed over things, I'm happy to go back over them as well, because I don't know if that was a lot to take in half an hour or not.
Well, I have a question. Maybe if people are nervous to speak up, I certainly have a few questions. So I'm really interested in the results that you found with your first experiment with the political divide on truthiness. And I'm just curious if you have thought about, or if your students have thought about, anything else related to the political divide that could potentially explain why there was this big difference.
Yeah, we certainly have, and in conversations with my colleagues, we've thought about it as well. What I didn't present in the data here, but what we actually collected in experiment 1, and we'll probably collect in experiment 2, although we're not entirely sure if it's the right idea, is a measure of critical thinking. So there's it's called the CRT, and it's a short form of it. It consists of 3 questions, which kind of tap into the people's propensity to really sort of slow down and think critically about things versus just thinking heuristically and adopting a more heuristic approach. They're essentially questions that are designed to, if you're thinking really quickly and not stopping to really consider the answer to the question, you'll probably get it wrong. So they're designed in that way, and it's measured on a very brief scale. There's a long form of it as well. We included that because there's some evidence to show that some of the differences amongst the political left and the political right, not for this kind of thing, but for other things, can be driven by differences in critical thinking. And so we wondered if that might be a contributor as well. It turns out, though, that for us at least, it doesn't seem to be contributing at all. But that could be a consequence of the fact that there's so little variation in people's responses on that scale. When we use that short form three question thing, virtually everyone gets everything wrong, because we just have this tendency to respond with our sort of gut level. That's the default mode that we walk through the world with. And so very few people actually really stop to consider the questions in any depth and to get to that correct answer. So on the one hand, it could be that people's critical thinking isn't contributing, and so there may be some other things going on. On the other hand, it could be that it is, but we've just failed to find any sufficient variation in our sample, so we can't answer that question, which is why we're sort of a little hesitant whether it's the right thing to include in the second experiment. We're trying to figure out, are there better ways to measure maybe that or some other mechanism out there that might be responsible as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I guess I should say there's also literature out there that suggests that what underscores the difference between the political left and political right, and any differences you find amongst them, is this idea that people are just, based on their political affiliation, they motivate their reasoning in certain ways, right? And so if you have a set of beliefs that have developed with a cohort of people that you think of as your group, you are motivated to reason in ways that are consistent with those beliefs, those pre-existing beliefs, or the beliefs that that group holds. And so that's another avenue to potentially explore as well, although I'm not exactly sure how we would investigate differences there exactly in terms of motivated reasoning. But there's probably people here who could advise me on that. Yeah.
It made me think of something else as well, that I'd be interested in your thoughts about whether you think that these results would be replicated in other countries. So would you see similar things in, say, the UK, where you have what, the Labour Party and the Tories or what have you? And I think that's what they're called. I don't know, but I think so. But, you know, if this would be something that would be kind of a worldwide phenomenon versus like conservative and liberal, if you will.
Yeah, I wondered about that as well, because, and I really don't know what the answer would be. Like, I'm really not sure what the results would look like, because on the one hand, it certainly feels like, oh, I shouldn't say feels like, that's a terrible thing for a scientist to say, but it seems to me that the political messaging here in the States has been incredibly divisive over COVID-19. I'm just mainly talking about anecdotal experience now from what I've seen about it. And I don't know, from talking to sort of friends and family back home in New Zealand, my impression is that it's not the same there. The messaging that they get about it doesn't have that same kind of divisive element to it. But then maybe that's because I associate with people who are like me. So I know a bunch of people who are like me in New Zealand, and I'm not seeing maybe the other side of the fence so much. I don't know. I think my gut response here, Erica, is that we'd probably see similar patterns of results, but maybe not quite so drastic or dramatic, I think, yeah. But I think it would be really great to collect some international samples to see what happens. I don't know if that's what, if you like, do you agree? Or I'm interested in what you think about it.
I mean, I would imagine the same thing a little bit, you know, anecdotally talking with people who specifically are from the UK, and them discussing their experiences with living in the United States, but having their families be in the UK and having a very different kind of conversation with people here versus in the UK, that it's much less divisive, as you've said. So that makes sense to me. It seems right.
Yeah, one of the things that's funny about the showing that influence of the political affiliation is that originally this is not something we were going to measure in the study, because it wasn't really of direct interest. And it's only through conversations about planning the experiment out that we kind of realized, like, oh, we better actually, seems like it might be relevant, so we better include something, right? And then it turned out to be way more influential and dramatic than we had anticipated. So yeah, I'm glad we did include it.
I mean, I have another question, but if somebody else has a question and I'm just hogging the time, please ask in the chat or raise your hand and we can get to you. But in the interim, so specifically going back to the photos, because with that first experiment, the photos didn't have the intended effect. And you mentioned that potentially the manipulation was subtle. So do you think that there would be a way to make the manipulation stronger so that it might have more of effect, and what that would look like specifically for, say, COVID-19?
Yeah, there's probably a few different ways you could achieve something like that. My concern is maybe largely methodological, in that running it online through Qualtrics, we don't have a good degree of control over like when the photograph, like it might be loading for people on slow connections or something. Maybe for some people it just fails to show up altogether, or they click so fast that they don't really even see it. Those kinds of things I think I'm worried about in terms of the methodology. But setting those kinds of issues aside, I think if we wanted to strengthen the manipulation, we could actually turn to some prior research that's tried to answer questions about what really matters about the photo, like what characteristics of the photo are important for when it does versus does not influence people. And it seems to be the case, I hope I'm remembering this correctly based on the work that's been done, that the photograph does have to bear some relationship to the claim for it to be influential. So for example, if the claim was that coronavirus is a bioweapon, and it's a picture of some hay or just some random thing, it's probably not going to do anything at all to people's judgments. And in fact, I think there's research to show that when the photograph is unrelated, it can almost backfire and have the opposite effect, where people will rate things now more false when there's an unrelated photograph, presumably because they're like, why is this here? That seems suspicious or something. Maybe it's something along those lines. So I suspect if we really wanted to strengthen the manipulation, we'd have to try and get a really good pool of photos that are highly related to the claim, while at the same time ensuring that they don't help people answer the question, because then it's no longer a sort of decorative thing and it would be probative. It sounds like it would be a real challenge to do, but it could be something that could strengthen the manipulation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just curious, like specific to COVID-19, because, I think that potentially there might be like, ethical issues to strengthen photos related to a disease, that potentially it would increase somebody's emotional response to the image that might make them rate something as more truthful versus less false, what have you. But then you're running the risk of potentially traumatizing people in some sort of way. I don't know. But it's just something that came up in my head. So thank you. And any more questions for Dr. Michal? All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Michal, to come to speak to us. That was fascinating. And thank you to all of our audience members for coming to watch. We're certainly glad that you're here. These talks will be, or have been recorded, and will be posted to YouTube in a couple days, I believe. So you'll be able to see those, but hope to see y'all at some other talks. Thank you.
Thank you.